Hello and welcome to Plant Taxonomy. This is a course that's going to cover the diversity of plants. Big emphasis on flowering plants and also emphasis on plants you can find in Wisconsin, plants that have economic value, and plants that are generally more diverse or more abundant in the world. So a little bit of an introduction to the topic and skewed towards plants you're more likely to run into or talk about. Of course, this kind of class can't teach you everything about plants on the first pass, but hopefully it'll give you a good foundation to build your knowledge. If you end up having a career that deals more in identifying plants or studying plants, hopefully this will be a nice springboard into learning more about those plants. So my introduction image here, this is a photograph that I took in Australia. A little bit of a plug for, I guess, some of the fun things you can do if you get into graduate studies in plants. So I was studying water plants, and this is one of the habitats that we went to. A big diversity of plants here. You can see some trees and some grasses in the different parts of this image, and there would also be some plants in the water. And so knowing what they are is a big foundation for understanding bigger picture kinds of questions. So ecology of an area, diversity, evolution, all kinds of features are wrapped up in this topic of plant taxonomy. So let's get going. So I like to start my plant classes with this image, just an illustration of how important plants are in the world. So this is, I believe, a composite image of global, I guess you can kind of see the different shades of color on these different parts of the world. And you'll notice that one of the biggest colors on the terrestrial habitats is green, right? So we have the blue for the water, and the next more abundant color on here is green. It's just lush throughout all these parts of the Northern Hemisphere, all through Northern Eurasia, most of North America, big chunk of South America, and so on. And so this greenness tells us that there are plants growing there. And I like to highlight this, that this is a kind of organism that you can see evidence of from space. So in spite of humans' major impact on the world, in this image, you don't really see evidence of humans. Kind of remarkable in that way, but we definitely see evidence of the plants. And so whether you care to study them or not, they are out there and they are making a big impact on the world. This is kind of a fanciful illustration that I grabbed once. Just kind of like how it's organized, and also how it kind of has this central image of the energy coming into the system. So it's focused mostly on animals, as you can see. The different colors are highlighting the different major taxonomic groups of animals. Obviously not the focus of this class, but one that you might be familiar with. So we have groups of mammals and birds and fish and reptiles and so on. And at the center of this image, all these different lines are connecting their way down to this central circle of green. So there's a green set of organisms in the center, not shown as being very diverse here. Of course, they would be very diverse and numerous, but just for the sake of this image, they're in the center, so they don't get to take up a lot of space. But it's showing you that there are the plants at the center of this, basically forming the foundation for the energy that sustains all these different animal groups. So whatever animal you might be interested in, that animal depends on plants for its food. This is true for almost everything that is alive on Earth. It either makes its own food from the sun, or it gets its food by eating organisms that make their food from the sun. And if we're looking at multicellular terrestrial organisms, this is skewed very heavily toward plants and animals that eat plants. So we're also highlighting here, it's a big focus on energy. So the energy that the plants provide is given to them by the sun. So this foundational process of photosynthesis in the center, fueling the plants, allowing them to build their body structures. And then that energy that they put into their tissues becomes the stuff that animals eat. So whether you eat plants or you eat animals that eat plants, you are consuming energy that came into the plants from the sun. And that's what keeps life going. So as we get into this topic, also, I like to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about as far as what is a plant. So we use the term plant. Scientifically, it has a little bit more of a narrow definition here. So when we talk about plant, I think maybe the convenient way to think about this is to talk about plants as land plants. And that's the kind of general term for them. They have a little more scientific definition. The embryophytes is one way to talk about them as well. Embryophytes. If you want to know more about embryophytes, you can take my fall course called The Plant Kingdom. And just a little emphasis here is that the land plants are defined not necessarily by being on land exclusively, but the fact that their ancestor came onto land. So if you want to take an animal parallel here, for example, whales and seals are mammals and they live in the oceans, but their ancestors were on land. They descended from terrestrial animals and then got back into the land. In the same way, we have some aquatic plants that have terrestrial ancestors. They're still in this so-called land plant group. So land plants, maybe a little better illustration is to look at the images of these kinds of plants we're talking about here. So basically across the top of this image, we have three images that are land plants. We've got a fern on the left here, a group of ferns, a cluster of mosses here in the middle, and then a conifer, a gymnosperm conifer tree here. These all qualify as land plants, and their ancestor was a land plant. And down at the bottom are three kinds of organisms that are not technically plants. So one thing you'll notice is that they are green. They're able to do photosynthesis, but as we draw this line, we sort of decided that the line of cutoff is the ancestor of plants that came onto land. And these are groups that are still living in the oceans, living in fresh water, probably fresh water more than ocean for some of these. So this is a kind of green algae, a single-celled green algae. This is a cyanobacterium, also known as a blue-green algae. I much prefer the term cyanobacteria. So single cells strung together on these linear chains. And then this is a multicellular green alga, also one that lives in fresh water. And some of these that are the so-called freshwater, the ancestors of the land plants, some of those can be found on land, but not really in any appreciable size or kind of organism you'd really notice without knowing what you were looking for. So plants, these land plants, total number of species is an estimate. So estimates vary, but they kind of hover around this number, 450,000 species. It's an estimate because we have a set of species that we've named, scientists have named, and then there are estimates about how many species have not been named, but still exist out there. And they've kind of agreed upon these days, numbers pretty close to this 450,000 species. And second bullet point here mentions the little bit stricter definition of what it means to be a land plant. So land plants are multicellular, contrast them with some of those algae and cyanobacteria. Generally photosynthetic, some of them, as we'll see, have lost the ability to do photosynthesis. And then having chloroplasts, this is a eukaryotic feature. And that would set them apart from the cyanobacteria in the center here. So these are the photosynthetic organisms. Some of them, there are more besides these, especially a lot of marine organisms can do photosynthesis, but are not in the land plant group. So we have kind of a wide diversity here. In the center is actually a bacterium, cyanobacterium. And then on either side are these green algae in a eukaryote group. So this class, we're going to focus a lot on the angiosperms. And the angiosperms, that's the scientific term, a little more strict definition for the flowering plants. So land plants consists of a few different groups, as we'll see. And narrowly within those, a little more narrowly, are the flowering plants. And you'll see that this is by far the majority of the land plants as far as number of species. So there are lots of land plants, and most of those are flowering plants. So a few reasons why we're going to focus on the flowering plants. They are more numerous. They're very diverse, as you can see. They're charismatic. They're plants that people tend to be interested to see, and they have economic value and so on. So we've kind of got our hands full just focusing on the flowering plants. And so that's what we're going to do in this course. Lots to look at. So flowering plants has this scientific term. The official term for them is angiosperms, or I guess a little more, I don't know, pretentious. So angiosperms, that angio part refers to a vessel or a container. And sperm here, unfortunately, there's sort of an interesting Greek origin for that word. Sperm does not mean sperm exactly, it means seed in this context. So this refers to a organism that's got its seeds inside of a container. That refers to the flowers, but also to the fruits. And so fruit, if you think about an edible fruit that's got seeds inside, that's sort of the container for those seeds that tells you that you've got an angiosperm. So flowers, and then also as shown here, fruits. Lots of diversity of fruits. Fruits are not just what you think of as those juicy, colorful, tasty things that you eat. But fruits also, the definition of fruit extends out into structures that are dry, unremarkable as far as things you might want to eat. And so on the right hand here are a little bit of a sample of fruit types that you might see in the flowering and fruiting plants. So angiosperms altogether, that group makes flowers. They also make fruits. And so these will be some of the features that we use to talk about them and also highlight the diversity that we're looking at in this class. So while we're thinking about interesting plants, just want to, I guess, point out some of the more noteworthy plants as we're getting started here. This slide is showing some, I guess, illicit drugs, some illicit or recreational drugs that people get from plants. So if you want to know your plants, these ones might be some that you want to start learning about. On the upper left here, this is the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. And this is the plant that people get opium and heroin and many derivatives, morphine and so on, derived from these chemicals that are basically plant defenses, but have an interesting effect that some people choose to encounter. It's kind of where our recreational drugs sit, right? So plants are trying to hurt us, and some of these things don't hurt exactly. Some people find them interesting. On the right-hand side, this is a cactus plant that produces the chemical peyote. Down on the bottom left here, this is the coca plant, where people get cocaine from. And bottom right, a little more legal plant these days, but not entirely legal, cannabis sativa, the plant otherwise known as marijuana, producing one of those recreational drugs. A little more socially acceptable, we've got some plants here that are plants you might encounter on a more regular basis. A few of these have some stimulants in them. So camellia, this is the tea plant. So tea has caffeine in it. The bottom right is a coffee plant. Coffee has caffeine. That's mostly what people are interested in their coffee, I think. And then the upper right, this is a plant that also has a little bit of caffeine, but also this molecule called theobromine. Theobroma is a plant from South America that we get chocolate from. So chocolate or cacao, Theobroma cacao is its scientific name. And in the lower left here, this is a plant that we get sugar from. One of the plants that people can get sugar from, called sugar cane, in the grass family. So kind of knowing what these plants are, how they're related to other plants would help you to identify them, and also, I suppose, maybe explore more about their biology if you're interested in the chemicals they make. Maybe looking for additional wild species or something like that as you want to study them. Closer to home, we've got some plants that feature really abundantly in southern Wisconsin, down into Illinois, if some of you are from there. And these are two big plants that grow in our area. We've got on the left, this is a soybean plant, Glycine X in the bean family or the legume family. And then on the right, corn or maize in the grass family. Scientific name is Zea maize. So you're familiar with a lot of plants already. I suspect you might be able to identify a good number of them on your own already, hoping in this class to kind of put them into context and also point out some of the a little more difficult to identify differences sometimes. So this is an example of a couple plants you might run into where one of these plants is not particularly harmful. The plant on the left actually is the Queen Anne's lace, which is a wild version of the plant that's cultivated for carrots, Daucus carota. And it's in the same plant family and has a flower arrangement very similar to what you would encounter in this plant. This is poison hemlock. So being able to tell the difference between these plants can be the difference between life or death. Personally, I don't want to get anywhere near something in this plant family when I'm looking for something to eat. I don't forage much in general, but I would just avoid plants in the carrot family altogether because some of them could kill me. Maybe you're interested in this topic from an animal perspective. Animals are pretty good taxonomists. So we approach a plant and we use our a little more logical brains to kind of piece the identification together, carefully looking at leaves and flowers and so on. Animals, a lot of times, they might key into a particular scent chemical, a particular color wavelength or something like that. So their life, their livelihood is tied to identifying the correct plant for them to eat, for them to lay their eggs in or whatever they're doing. And just on this slide, I've got some examples of animals that have really close associations with the plants that they're interacting with. So a lot of them have actually the name of the plant in their common name for the animals. So milkweed bugs, commonly found on milkweeds. Milfoil weevil, this is a bug that eats water milfoil. Fig wasps are important for pollinating figs, and so on, as you can see on here. And then just in general, you might also want to identify the kind of habitat you're in based on the plants you can find there. So I suspect you could look at this image and probably make a pretty good guess as to where these different images were taken. So for example, we have a coconut palm. This is one that grows in warm tropical places, also typically pretty close to ocean water. So it's a plant that can actually disperse its seeds, which are coconuts, on the ocean and have them establish on beaches. A couple of these with broad, smooth leaves. These are plants that grow in wet tropical areas. Philodendron, banana. So they kind of get away with bigger leaves that in our climate, big leaves are something you'd have to lose in the winter, basically. So big leaves on tropical plants. Cattails, very distinctive plant of wetlands. Cactus, if you found a cactus, you would guess that you're in probably some areas that stay dry for a long time of the year. Dandelions, kind of a sign around here of a weedy area. So an area that's sort of been modified by people, but also let go a little bit. And then this is a plant in the lower right. This is an alpine plant, Linaria alpina. And if you weren't interested in anything we've talked about so far, maybe you just want to learn about some of the interesting, quirky little things that plants can do. So we have some examples of animal associations. So acacia plants, some of those partner with ants that can live inside of their spines. They eat these nutritious little structures that are produced at the ends of the leaflets. And the plant basically provides them food and a place to live in exchange for defense. So these ant colonies that live in acacia are very aggressive defenders of the acacia if a herbivore comes along. Some plants are carnivorous. This is a sundew that's carnivorous. Here we've got Spanish moss, just kind of an interesting trivia plant. It's actually a flowering plant and it's related to pineapples and gets this common name of moss. It looks kind of mossy, but actually a flowering plant. Top right is a plant that disguises itself like rocks in the desert to avoid being eaten. And then in the lower right, this is the world's smallest flowering plant, plants in the genus Wolfia. They float on the water surface. And that's all there is to it. They're so small you can kind of make out the contours of individual cells on there. So these are really small. They're called duck meal, kind of the size of cornmeal grains. So in this course, we're going to talk about diversity, big emphasis on terminology and being able to talk about plants, being able to identify plants. We'll have some practice at identifying plants in the field later in the semester, learning about classifying them. So just having a big body of knowledge to talk well about plants, to understand when you encounter a plant, kind of where it fits into the big picture of plant diversity. And we'll do a little bit about ecology and little quirky things that each plant group can do as we encounter them.